of the Future, Flipping Case Methodology as a Tool for Decolonization. I am Natasha, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship, Faculty of Business and Law. I'm a case methods enthusiast, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to rub off some of my enthusiasm off of you today. What I'm presenting today is based on a few experiments I've done in my passion with cases. So we'll be presenting the results of some approaches to case writing, so the way the cases were developed, as well as sharing how I believe case studies in our use of case studies for teaching can be effective in addressing some of the main issues around decolonization. The content of this presentation is part of a research paper that is currently under review. And I believe that with the feedback that I'll be able to get from this session, your comments, your questions, hopefully I'll be able to improve my articulation of some of the arguments that I'd like to be making today. Okay, so my presentation is going to be organized as you can see. I will start off with defining what I believe the case studies of the future look like. I will also be sharing my rationale for why we need to flip case studies and why there's an argument for us to think about flipping this methodology at this point in time. I will share with you the process, so particularly with respect to writing the cases and addressing some of the potential issues around whether to place flipped case studies within a pedagogical framework or within an andragogy. And then I will present my sort of mapping exercise of the cases that are developed through this method and how they help us achieve some of our goals from a decolonization agenda. Okay, so for me, the case studies of the future are those that I visualize being capable of equipping our students with the skills for the future. What I mean by that is that no one should be left behind. When we talk about the case studies of the future, they should create an environment of learning that ensures that students are not left behind. In the first instance, these cases are created in partnership. And what this means is that they are created alongside our students, alongside the enterprises that are focused within them, as well as alongside the communities. The communities also play a part in the case development. These cases are also active in that they engage the students. Students are not going to be passive in the development of the cases or even in the teaching of the cases. They are very much an active part of the process. These cases of the future are the ones that will allow for the acquisition of data literacy. They will encourage cognitive flexibility and expose students to technology. These are all things that I think are relevant in terms of the skill set for the future. There are also case studies that will be used in creating knowledge. So not just being used as an instrument of conveying what we believe students should learn, but they should be a conduit for developing new knowledge. So they actually serve a purpose beyond teaching. Several scholars, forecasters, and practitioners agree that the skills of the future include things like communication and emotional intelligence. They also talk about the skills of the future being those that allow for creativity and leadership, that students should be able to embrace change, and that they should have analytical thinking, judgment, and decision-making, as well as social influence. By partnering with students in the case studies and the case methods that I'm going to be presenting to you, you will be able to see how all these skills can be developed and embedded into the case methodology. So both during the crafting of the cases and through the teaching of the cases. So when we talk about the partnership in particular, the partnership is really an area in which the communication skills of students can be developed. It is through partnership that students will embrace the various diversities amongst themselves, as well as an appreciation of the cultural context that the enterprises and the communities that they live in are embedded. Their emotional intelligence is also enhanced, and we'll be able to see how this actually plays out during the case methods, so during the case development and delivery. Okay, so one may argue that these skills of the future may be harnessed in other ways. So why should we focus on the case study as a medium? Okay, so I've got the suspicion that many of us do use case studies in any case as part of our teaching, and they've been relevant and continue to be for a number of reasons. So this will not be new to many of it. In the first instance, we use case studies because they help us to abstract learning. Okay, so they facilitate the principle and understanding by abstraction. They also help us to get students to a point where they're able to look at a particular problem and consider problem solving within that particular context. Most case studies are decision focused, and this is what enables us to create an environment where they can harness the problem solving skills. Case studies are also important because they encourage reflection, particularly if they're well written and are able to place the learner in the mind of the protagonist that is featured within the case. The other reason we really love case studies is because many of them are actually a really good story, and who doesn't love a good story? So the storytelling aspect of it makes learning not seem like a chore, so it helps create a fun environment for learning, particularly if there's a good storyline to follow. Case studies are useful for testing theory, both in our research and our teaching. So it helps us identify where theory and practice meet, but it also helps us identify where there are gaps in theory and practice. Case studies help us to make complex knowledge accessible, and I find this to be the case even for postgraduate learners who would have been exposed to case studies from undergraduate. By the time they're getting to postgraduate, you'd find that even the complex knowledge there is best conveyed through the case method. The last point that you see there has to do with the fact that the academy has moved from shunning case research. Case research has largely been looked down upon for a long time because it's usually based on this one unique case. So the case that doesn't quite fit the norm and therefore cannot be generalized. Fortunately, generalization of research is no longer what sits on the pedestal of good research. So case studies, provided that they are able to meet a few criteria that I'll be sharing, can contribute to knowledge, even if they seem to be just a one-off anomaly in nature. Okay, so we turn to the question of why we should flip case studies. Because I think I've made a case of why cases are so great, but what is this flip to the future actually really about? What does it entail, and what gap are we trying to fill? In my experience of teaching cases, I've found that case studies have become quite traditional in how they're developed and also how they're used in the class. In other words, many of them have actually become a little bit boring. Boring to read, boring to teach, and this is really creating a gap between how students learn and what students would like to learn. So there's a need for us to do something about the content, the way the case studies are created, and what the case studies actually address. The other thing about case studies is some of them are actually really good, but they need to be refreshed. So it's not checking out everything that exists and trying to write everything anew, but it's really about making it interesting, making it relevant. With the times that we're in, we all agree that it's not everything that we were teaching face-to-face that can easily be moved online. So there's actually a call to create content that can be suitable for multimodal teaching. Some case studies are great for the face-to-face environment, but a complete disaster to deliver in an online setting. So this is where we need to think about cases that can be written from the perspective of being converted into various forms. A snapshot case, integrated case, role-play case studies, and so on. What's really important for me is being able to move students from a point of just receiving what they learn and applying it to getting that sense of owning their knowledge. So getting the confidence that they have actually mastered what they're learning. So the problem solving and ownership matching, knowledge ownership matching is important. The other thing that we said case studies are great for is this opportunity for learners to be able to reflect on their learning. But this reflection means nothing if these case studies are not allowing for deep learning, if they're not allowing for critical thinking, analysis, and implementation. Many case studies stop at the first two, deep learning and critical thinking, whereas analysis and implementation are not a common feature of all case studies. Okay, so some really great case studies do include these, but these are not many in practice. Okay, so how urgent is this need to flip? Okay, in the first instance, I really want to build on the momentum of the success of the flipped classroom. Many people have experimented with this method of instruction. Many of us have had to do it as part of our blended teaching offering, and it works. So the idea of flipping resonates and carries some of the principles of flipping the classroom, and we will be applying this to the case method. So the reality of teaching now is also compatible with what I'll be proposing. So there is compatibility of the flipped case method with blended learning. The skills of the future that I started off with need to be developed now. Okay, they're skills of the future, but you can't develop them at the point that they're required. So we as instructors need to play a role in making sure that those skills are being developed now. And the cases that I will be sharing with you help us to do that. And for those of us that are active researchers, we have been reminded time and time again that this is not the time to be doing face-to-face research. So for those of you who are not interested in cases as an instrument for teaching, perhaps this is something you could look at as an opportunity to do a different form of research. Case-based desk research is something that could be used to fill your time and still allow you to make a contribution in the research world. Okay, so I'm not going to be speaking about how we actually flip cases. Now, this is from the crafting perspective. This is based on the teaching element. I hope that so far I've been able to make a case for cases and how they may be useful for the skills of the future. So this section is making the assumption that you're all fully converted to using cases in your teaching and also in your research. Okay, so I'm going to be illustrating the flipping of the cases with 4 original case studies that I developed. Each case was developed on the premise of a specific personal principle of decolonization. Okay, so the principles of decolonization that I will be linking each of these cases to is firstly, being able to address a research gap. Secondly, being able to look beneath the surface. Thirdly, being able to teach students what they want to learn. And lastly, being able to revisit the known. Okay, so the first case study is the one you see in front of you. That's Fiery Phoenix PLC, Entrepreneurial Survival in Zambia. This one addresses the need for a research gap that had to be filled. Okay, so the context of this particular case was that there was a call made for casework in emerging markets context. This call was made by Emerald Emerging Markets Case Journal, and they wanted to feature more emerging markets case studies. So I really wanted to respond to the call because I come from an emerging market myself. Zambia is my home country. In trying to think about what case I could investigate in Zambia, there were the typical ones that most people might find interesting. So the big successful state-run corporations. Then we had a few multinational examples. And then the one thing that Zambia is actually famous for is its mining. So there were a few cases I could write about all that. But for me, I really wanted to do more than fill a gap within the emerging markets literature. One thing that I have noticed across many of the cases that I teach, regardless of the context of the case, is that there are not many female protagonists. And I teach a lot of, I've been teaching modules within strategy as well as entrepreneurship, but most recently, mainly within strategy. And it makes me wonder, are females not strategists? Why are they so rarely featured? So this is something that, as a personal passion, I decided to just take on to say, I really want to feature a female protagonist in an emerging market. So I went about, going through my list of contacts, lists of small businesses, because small business research is also another area of interest, and looking for stories. Okay, so it's looking for stories specifically to fill this gap, to create a case study that is going to feature a female protagonist in an emerging market. The central theme that emerged from the stories I was collecting was issues around business ethics and how difficult it is for women in Zambia to set up and run businesses and sort of abide by the rules of the game, so to speak. And that really is what motivated this particular case study. So the research gaps in summary that informed this study were, firstly, that there are very few female protagonists in teaching cases, and also that there are very few teaching cases set in emerging markets. So the outcome of this work and just trying to fill this research gap was that I was able to develop a new business ethics case that featured a female protagonist in an emerging market. And this case was then published by the Emerald Emerging Markets Case Collection. So I do welcome those of you that are interested in teaching ethics to look at that particular case study that I developed, because it does come with teaching notes, which will help you do some comparative work of what ethics mean using the frameworks that have been developed within the Western world versus ethics in an emerging market context. Okay. So the second case that we looks at the second principle, which is looking beneath the surface, okay, asking yourself, what else? This is sort of good research practice in any case, but for case studies, it means that when you're presented with a typical case, meaning that this particular organization is able to highlight this particular issue in business management, you should be able to ask yourself, what else does this business stand for? What else does this business represent? So the second case was on Kazuri Beads, Kenya. Kazuri Beads is a small business. They're a bead making business that are located in Karen, which is a small town just outside Nairobi. And I had the privilege of visiting this business as part of a conference program. So the Africa Academy of Management was hosting its conference in Nairobi in that particular year, and they organized this as part of the trip. The reason why they included this particular business was because they wanted to highlight how an African SME can become an international business. So it was really a rave about the success of an African SME. in crossing borders, so to speak. During the case, during the field study, I was actually intrigued by the so many things that had not been said about the business. So this was the what else. So firstly, the fact that it was an artisan business. Everyone that was there had learned their trade by being taught by, sort of a master craftsperson. The second key issue that really stood out to me was that it was founded by a woman and it was run 90% by women. So it was a woman-run business, highly successful, and that it had been built on the principles of fair trade practice. So all these things for me were actually more interesting and more intriguing than how they managed to internationalize. So in as much as there was a lovely case study about them going international, I decided to look at the same case, but looking at the things that had not been said about it. So the outcome of this particular exercise was being able to develop a multidisciplinary case written from the perspective of the unseen. So when I wrote up this piece, I shared it with a few colleagues within the European Academy of Management, and they encouraged me to apply for a grant so that I could actually use this particular case study and the techniques that I had used in crafting it into further research. So it was actually a very successful project. And what I found my students actually like about it is that it's got so many applications. There's something there about entrepreneurship. There's something there about business studies, something there about international business. And now that I've been able to add layers and layers to the case, it's actually become a really great multidisciplinary teaching case that you can actually fit into a range of modules. Okay, so the third case is on Uber, a bumpy ride in South Africa. So this looks at Uber, the ride-sharing company, ride-sharing app, and its experience within South Africa. This case was developed in response to the question of what students wanted to learn, okay, which is what I say is sort of my third personal principle of decolonization. You need to teach students what they want to learn. Okay, so how did this come about? In looking through various case studies and so on, and quite a regular practice of mine, at the start of many of my classes, I like to ask my students, which organizations fascinate you and why? Okay, so based on these discussions, it came about that many students at that particular time were quite interested in Uber. Now, this was while I was teaching back in South Africa. At that time, Uber was relatively new and it was doing very, very well in international context. So from its country of origin and a few other countries it had gone into. But when it came into South Africa, there were quite a lot of challenges that it was facing. And so the students were curious as to how this organization was going to, would it survive in South Africa? And how would it respond, given that it's a completely different environment, different rules apply, and so on? Would they be able to have generic strategies, or would they have something more tailored to this very unique? This was a case study that was actually developed in partnership with the students, and it's been one of my most enjoyable case writing experiences, because every time a student used Uber, that was an opportunity to collect data. It was an opportunity to feed into the case that was being written. At the end of the day, we ended up coming up with what I thought was a really good case, and we decided to submit it to a case writing competition. And it did win the award, John Molson MBA Case Writing Award for short cases. So this was something also just really inspirational for the students to say that they were co-authors in this, and that other people were interested in reading what they wrote. So this was a really important part of their learning experience as well. The last case that I'll be sharing with you is one that has been a case in progress over the last 2 years. And this has to do with Amazon and Apple as the masters of global strategy. With this, the attempt really is to revisit the known. Okay, so Amazon and Apple are globally renowned firms, largely with reputations in logistics, innovation, and leadership. What I wanted to do with these cases is actually use them to teach my whole module. So use them to teach every single topic within the module. What typically happens with most strategy textbooks or strategy curricula is that each topic has got a featured case. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with this approach. But what I found is that for many students, they fail to make the connections between what is happening in one case and what is happening in another. So bringing in just these cases to use throughout the teaching year, I found gave the students an opportunity to integrate their learning. So these cases were cases that we used as live teaching cases. So we really started out with very minimal information about them. And we were then giving students week by week, according to the topic that is on offer, further information about what is happening within those organizations based on linked to the topic. So the outcome of this is that over the last 2 years, we've actually, by the end of the teaching year, we would have created active current case material that is related to the case. Now, this case material has been created collaboratively with the students. So the module team will present some summary information, very brief at the start, and then students then contribute to the case through a collaborative wiki. So they conduct their own research based on the questions that are given to them during their workshops, and then they contribute their answers. As they do that, we sort of go into this reflective exercise about what has been contributed. Is it true? Is it not? Does it make sense? Is it aligned to the theory? What should this actually look like in practice? And this has then been sort of moderated, if you like, by practitioners. Okay, so in the first year of doing this, we're able to get some inputs from a few executives at Amazon and Apple to review our overall assessment of their organization within global strategy in terms of what they were doing and what we thought they were doing and what we thought they should be doing. And in this second year, we're able to do a similar thing by bringing in a global strategist who has been a consultant to both firms to look at the material that we have created so far. So we really have a rich case that we've been able to put together about Amazon and Apple over the last 2 years. And at the moment, we have an article that is under review, but the pre-submission editorial feedback on it was actually really positive and indicative of a potential contribution to case pedagogy, but also overall teaching. So the involvement of the students, the collaboration with the industry guests, and so on. So if we have time at the end, I'll be able to share with you some of the quotes from the students about the experience of working together in developing these cases. Okay, so now that we've had a look at these cases, the 4 cases, I think it's really important for us to appreciate the process of teaching that complements these flipped cases. Typically, whenever we're teaching undergraduate students, many people go for the sort of pedagogical approach where you can see the various assumptions that are made about the learner and the instructor. I find that in trying to teach cases effectively with these goals for decolonization and with this intention to deliberately flip the cases, you actually need a mix of the two. Now, I don't know if there's a term that characterizes this blend, half pedagogy, half andragogy. I really don't know if there is. I've been trying to look. I haven't come across it. So if there is a term that characterizes this blend, I'm hoping that someone could point me in that direction so that I can explore this further. The features of the flipped case teaching process are the ones that I have highlighted. So in terms of the learner and how they learn, there is full responsibility on the part of the instructor for what is taught. Okay, so the instructor is still there to create sort of the shell of what needs to be delivered, the actual teaching outcomes, and the baseline material. That is the responsibility of the instructor. The instructor is also involved in evaluating learning. However, the learner has room for self-direction, and this is where having perhaps multiple cases, options of which case to work with, comes in. Also options in which particular direction to explore. So it could be the same case study, but you want to look at this case in the context of assessing their resources and capabilities. Or with another, you want to look at their value chain. So it could be the same case, but being examined under very different topics or theoretical concepts. And the student then self-directs when it comes to that. With this particular mode, there's also a lot of self-evaluation on the part of the student, and that's because they self-directed in the first instance, so they will constantly be critiquing themselves and wanting to get that feedback as to whether what they're doing is right before they gain that confidence and full independence that comes with this particular method. We do make an assumption, because these flipped cases have been developed for undergraduates specifically, that the learner is coming to the activity with little experience. However, we also want to leverage on whatever experience they have, whether it is through part-time or volunteer work, or whether it's their knowledge of someone else in the world of work. And then we want to bring that experience into the classroom. We found that that has really been useful in generating rich cases, but also in helping students understand the application of the cases beyond the context they're set in. The experience of the instructor is still the most influential. So the instructor really needs to position themselves as a reliable expert that the student can turn to. Not that they know all the answers, but they have the capacity to guide the student in the right direction, even when they don't. Okay, so the other distinctions here are that students will still need to be told what to do. So clear instructions are a really important part of this exercise. I think in my first few experimentations, I was more optimistic about how self-directed the students would be, but then I learned that that self-direction actually evolves over time. So it's something that they mature into. It is still important that there is prescribed subject matter, because that gives them a sense of comfort, something they can turn to, something that's reliable, something that is set in stone, rather than the fluidity of the case method itself. And therefore, you need to have a lot of structure in terms of how you sequence the material, even if there's going to be fluidity in what is happening in each particular session. Okay, so the learning needs to have, apologies for that, the learning needs to have relevance to real life tasks, and we have to recognize how students are motivated. Okay, so with this particular method, yes, there's the reward of participating in developing the case, feeling like you have mastered the knowledge. There's this self-confidence that is developed in the student. So all those are great internal motivators, but they're also externally motivated. So certainly they want to do well, and a blend of the two is actually quite great, in my opinion. So yes, when it comes to flipping cases, I believe that students need to be viewed as transitioning from andragogy to pedagogy, and that instructors are from pedagogy to andragogy, and that instructors are facilitating that. Okay, so I'm now coming to the end, and what I'd like to do is conclude by emphasizing on how we can contribute to decolonization using cases, but perhaps not in the most radical ways as the flipping that I've just described. So call this a tilting of cases, if you will. So I'm going to be starting off with a call to look at old news in new perspectives. As mentioned before, I've been teaching business strategy, and one of the most prominent perspectives is the resource-based view of the firm. Most textbook and other men with this development, but they do neglect the widely acknowledged contribution right in the early 50s of Edith. Now, I don't think that's by accident. I think she's been overlooked simply because she was a woman. What I have done is I've been very deliberate about bringing her work into my strategy classes as a basis for case discussion. And this, in my opinion, is one small way people can actually practically contribute to decolonization of the curriculum. It's being able to say, we are still teaching you the same theory, but did you know this aspect of its development? Did you know that this was one of the key contributors? What were they thinking at the time? And also challenging the myth that women are not that strategic by being able to highlight her role and contribution in this space. What you'll see next to the beautiful picture of Penrose is a collection of pictures of various inventors, scientists who are very little known. Okay, so Black History Season happened to coincide with the delivery of our topic on invention, innovation, and imitation as tools of strategy. And I use this as an opportunity to introduce my students to these unknown faces behind popular daily products and services. All the unknown faces that were featured were people that were non-white. And for me, this was really important to share with the students so that they could also see themselves as potentially being able to contribute to the world in this remarkable way. A lot of the text material that we look at, particularly case study material, unfortunately, is still inundated with many Eurocentric perspectives of what strategy is like and also what strategic success looks like. So this for me was a really important way of conveying that message that no, it's not that it's starting now, it's always been. You have your place to contribute in a world that you may not typically see as a world you're part of in the pages of a strategy text. My second call is really to embrace diversity and change. If our world is changing, then why are we stuck on using the same cases year on year? Okay, so this is something that I think everyone should always review. Embrace studies that are more representative of the times that we are in, that may not be typical, that may exist in gray literature, and see what difference that could make. Third call is to leverage on the student voice. There's what we want students to learn, what we believe they should. There's what students would actually like to learn, what they believe they should. And I think there's a beautiful gray area of our agreement and disagreement. In my experience, when students learn what they want, they are willing to learn what you'd like them to. So invite them to play a part in selecting cases for their learning. This is one small way you could be using cases quite differently, giving the students a say in what cases they use. My fourth call is to use inclusive reading lists and teaching resources to support your case teaching. So you don't need to be over-reliant on the case study doing everything that you want it to. So in my teaching of strategy, I have incorporated modern day military diaries. So you'll see that on Strategy, a Primer, which is actually a fantastic read. I've also looked at relevant entertainment and news media. So these are available through our DMU library, Canopy, box of broadcasts for relevant media clips. I've also looked at direct insights from industry leaders. So HBR has a wonderful podcast network where they have captured podcasts on a range of themes. And what I've found particularly useful and refreshing and speaking directly to decolonization is being able to bring in industry leaders, practitioners as guest lecturers that can challenge the assumptions of the learners and catapult the appreciation of the cases that they're learning from not just hypothetical scenarios to this could be me making this decision next year. So what you'll see at the top right-hand corner is a very young man who I'd like to highlight. His impact has been phenomenal in my recent teaching. He's been my most recent practitioner guest. His name is Ashley Ainsley, and he was named in the Forbes 30 Under 30 in Europe for his impact in advocating inclusion of Black and minority people in the technology industry. He's a global strategist that has had my live case study firms on his books of clients. So he was actually invited for that purpose because he had direct links to these organizations. But his insider perspective on these cases was not only insightful from a strategic learning perspective, but it was also very inspirational and empowering to the students. And for me, this is what decolonization needs to look like when it works. So yes, if you can bring in a guest that is able to give your students a sense of belonging, that yes, they're in the right place, they're learning the right thing, that this material is for them, I think that really makes a big difference. And I think choosing the right case studies helps us do that. Okay, so I strongly recommend a read of the insights presented by Elizabeth Charles on decolonizing the curriculum. I had the mind to highlight the entire article, but I thought it best to be kind to your eyes and share with you just my top 5 quotes from her article. It was really tough to pick, but these are the ones that really struck a chord with me. The first is that we need to be more inclusive, but on merit. So not as a tokenistic gesture or tick box exercise. So let's be more inclusive with the case studies that we use, but these should stand up to academic rigor. They need to be relevant, but they also need to be well written and should be able to deliver on the objectives that have been set out in the first instance. We need to consider absolutely everything we study from new perspectives. Our worldview should not be dominated by one voice. And yes, there's an argument by others that there's not enough material out there, but this is my challenge to everyone that is listening to this call. Be that other voice. You can play a role in publishing these other case studies, creating this other material that doesn't exist. You are what you read, so you need to expose yourself to what is being written out there. Some of it may not be published in the spaces that are more comfortable or that you are more accustomed to reading, but if you look, you will find it. And our library has done a really good job in being able to bring some of this material much closer to us and making it accessible. Coincidentally, today is World Case Teaching Day. Yes, I know what you're thinking. There's actually a day for everything. So please join the case movement, and maybe this will be your role to play in decolonization. Okay, so that's it for me today. I can see that I'm clearly out of time, but I really would like to hear your feedback, even if it's just through email or whatever mechanism. But yes, that's my